I have been a teacher since 1967, off and on, and am currently teaching for Western Washington University, but I've always been close to the environment or interested in environmental issues, and almost everything I'm dealing with in the Sierra Club or the United Nations Association goes right back to corporate abuse. And so then I started becoming very interested in how all this abuse came to pass. And one of my personal goals is maybe by the end of this next year, within 12 months, to have memorized that chart up there. That chart was prepared by Jan Edwards and Molly Morgan. And if you go to YouTube, I didn't put YouTube up, I'll add it. If you go to youtube.com and Google Molly Morgan and corporate personhood, you will watch a video. You can watch a video which actually has a lot of the same information that I'm going to give you tonight. And once I was in a conference and this presenter said he didn't want to be a textbook wired for sound, but I do need my notes tonight, so I'm going to refer to them. I don't have all of this information permanently in my brain, so I'm going to be referring to my notes and ad-libbing a little along the way. I'm going to have my glasses. So I wanted to start out by saying thanks to this invitation from Catherine and the Finney Neighbors for Peace and Justice. This is a wonderful opportunity to maybe do a little more education. I suspect that many of you here have a knowledge base equal to mine on this topic. And it's a little bit intimidating because as I look around the room, I see long marchers for peace, long-time marchers for peace, and activists for peace. So raise your hand if you would, if you consider yourself fairly well read on the topic of corporate personhood. If you read a lot, okay, maybe 3 or 4, I'll bet there are more than that. But this first website up here is WILPF. It's a Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. They're the oldest women's peace organization in the world, founded in the 1800s. And they have a complete curriculum on civics, and it goes way back to even before the origins of our country and the English common law and some of the founding principles that are in our current laws. They have a curriculum that is free, downloadable, and we're actually using it in the 32nd Legislative District Democrats because we have kind of a built-in structure with all of our precinct committee officers. They're going to be the facilitators for this civics program, 10 months, 10 sessions, 10 months. So I invite you or encourage you to download this or maybe start some discussion groups in your neighborhoods. The Alliance for Democracy we formed in, I think it was 2003, and then we all got really busy on trying to impeach Bush and Cheney and elect Kucinich and do all kinds of wonderful things, and we kind of let our organization fall dormant. So I like to say we didn't drop it, excuse my voice, we didn't drop it, but it has been dormant, and I would like to revive it kind of and get it going again in the greater Seattle area. So that's why I'm passing around a clipboard tonight. So if you're interested at all in the Alliance and our work, and it's multidimensional, but it's all focused on supporting the pillars of democracy, education, free speech, the Constitution, and help me out, Claudia, what else? What? Oh, fair and clean elections, one of the 4 major pillars of democracy. So clean and fair elections, honest, trustworthy elections, education, free press, and so CELDEF is the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, lots of information there. POCLAD is the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, which is the think tank which started a lot of rights-based organizing throughout the U.S., but especially in New England, where there have been new ordinances passed to guarantee that townships, and in California, what is the name of the county where David Cobb is from? Humboldt County has passed ordinances guaranteeing that corporations do not have personhood. It stood without challenge for about 3 years, and then finally it was challenged, and I think it's been overturned, but they're not giving up down there. And then UNA is the United Nations Association, which is working on the Millennium Development Goals, and number 7 is the one that I'm working on, which is ensuring environmental sustainability. And then Wash Clean is up here, and if you think of any others, we can add them later. So why are we concerned about corporate personhood? So, as you know, with the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United versus the FEC, Federal Elections Commission, corporations would need less than, this is amazing to me, corporations would need less than 1% of their $605 billion in profit to make political expenditures that would double all current spending by all of the parties and federal candidates under this new ruling. Less than 1% of their corporate profits. Now remember, corporate profits are after they've paid the salaries and the bonuses and every kind of advertising and all those expenses. This is profit. Less than 1%. I think that alone is just reason enough for us to be interested in this. And what are we going to do about it? The origins of the concepts and principles in the United States Constitution go way back to ancient cultures and civilizations. Influences on the thinking of the founders of the USA. The U.S. Constitution were Greek and Roman laws and traditions, English common law, and many philosophers throughout the ages. Since we don't have time to discuss all of these influences tonight, we're going to focus on why and how the Supreme Court decisions have undermined the strengths of the Constitution and given more power to the wealthiest in our society. And Jan Edwards and Molly Morgan described them as the well-read, the well-bred, the well-fed, and the well-wed. Again, the well-read, the well-bred, the well-fed, and the well-wed. And those were the people who founded our nation and wrote the Constitution to favor themselves and to keep holding onto their property. So 90% of us or more were left out. The women, minority groups, ethnic minorities, the poor, most of society was left out of that original Constitution. So the solution was the writing of the Bill of Rights. So that chart up there depicts things above the line favored the corporations generally. Things below the line stood for the people or to increase the rights of people. Now, the Supreme Court case definitely increased the rights of corporations. So what we're going to be looking at tonight is the whole idea of personhood. The whole history of the United States could be determined or written around who is a person and who is not a person. So we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 14th is the amendment that gave the right of personhood to slaves. And I am not a corporate lawyer or even a lawyer of any kind, so I need to do a lot more studying of the amendments myself. But I wanted to read a little bit here tonight. Just a second. So another thing that we want to talk about is whether these are legal realities or legal fictions. And Molly Morgan and Jan Edwards call them legal fictions, but also they are realities in today's world as we face one challenge after another from corporations. So from a document that Molly and Jan wrote called Abolish Corporate Personhood, they talk about the amendments. Excuse me just a minute. Time out. Actually, have you heard of this book by Tom Hartman called Unequal Protection? It's called The Rise of Corporate Dominance and the Theft of Human Rights. This is where I was reading earlier today about the amendments. He writes, on July 9th, 1868, just after the Civil War, which was from 1861 to 1865, 3/4 of the states ratified the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution as part of a set of laws to end slavery. The intent of Congress and the states was clear: to provide full constitutional protections and due process of law to the now emancipated former slaves of the United States. The 14th Amendment's first article says in its entirety, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Along with the 13th Amendment, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States, and the 15th Amendment, the right of citizens of the United States to vote, shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So what happened to change all of that? Does anybody know? The railroads were seeking so much power not to be taxed, so the ability to not be taxed in the local and state jurisdictions, that they had a lot of money and they hired many lawyers to challenge the laws that taxed them, saying that they had personhood. And they argued it from about 1868 until 1886. There was a quiet period. I'm going to read a little bit of this. Let's see. They were claiming that they shouldn't have to pay local taxes because different railroad properties were taxed in different ways, in different places. And this constituted the creation of different classes of people, or persons, classes of persons, and was thus illegal discrimination. For almost 20 years, these arguments did not succeed. But in 1873, one of the first Supreme Court rulings on the 14th Amendment, which had been passed only 5 years earlier, involved not slaves but the railroads. So remember, the railroads were the big corporation that really did us in. Writing in the lead opinion, Justice Samuel Miller minced no words in chastising corporations for trying to claim the rights of human beings. And this book accounts justice after justice who stood up for that and wrote majority opinions denying corporations the right of personhoods. Let's see. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the issue of corporate personhood was frequently debated in newspapers and political speeches. The public was really interested in this, and there was a handful of the nation's largest corporations arguing for, but most of the voters, newspaper editorialists, and politicians were arguing against the whole notion of that corporations should have personhood. Across America, politicians were elected repeatedly on platforms that included the regulation of corporations, particularly the railroads. So anyway, this continued until 1886 when, it was Justice, the justice was, do you know the name of the justice? I'm trying to find his name here. Standing up for people only to be called persons, Justice Swain said in the slaughterhouse cases that by any person was meant all persons within the jurisdiction of the state. No distinction is intimated on account of race or color. Corporations have neither race nor color. He knew the amendment was intended to protect the life, liberty, and property of human beings. The language of the amendment itself does not support the theory, he wrote, that it was passed for the benefit of corporations. So this continued until 1886, when in a case which is shown up here, I have to move around a little bit. 1886, let's see, where is it? Back, okay, Santa Clara County, California versus Southern Pacific Railway. And the decision stated, the court does not wish to hear argument on the question of whether the provision in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which forbids a state to deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws, applies to corporations. They didn't want to deal with it. We are all of the opinion that it does. This statement by the Supreme Court before the hearing began gave corporations inclusion in the word person in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution and claim to equal protection under the law. So that just changed everything. And by having the rights of persons, they have all kinds of other rights. And states cannot go against them in any way. And so here we are. And I think at this point, I'd like to just mention a few of the solutions to this that have been proposed. And then later, Craig is going to talk much more in depth about one of them. Let's see, just one second. Some people are suggesting that we amend the Constitution And there is something called the Move to Amend movement. Ricky Ott and David Cobb are working very hard on this, just night and day, traveling all over the U.S. And I have a few of these bumper stickers if you'd like one. It says, "Constitutional rights for people, not for corporations. Sign the pledge at Move to Amend." Other people think that that would just take too long and we have to do something more quickly. So one of the solutions that has been proposed is in this book called The Failure of Corporate Law by Kent Greenfield. And in this, he says, long ago, there is still actually a principle or a doctrine called the doctrine or the principle of ultra vires, which means beyond the powers. So if in original chartering, if a corporation stepped outside or beyond its powers, it would lose its charter. So today, of course, I think we would have to really look at the charters and make sure that they serve the public good, because originally all corporate charters did that. And they were reviewed periodically, and if they were not within the bounds of their corporate charter, they lost they were put to death in a sense. So, and I've heard Tom Hartman speak about this, and he said, well, if corporations are persons and they kill people, shouldn't they be put to death? Shouldn't they have capital punishment and lose their charters? So bring back the ultra vires doctrine that applies to corporate charters, that applied to them in earlier times. This would revoke the charters of corporations and if they did not serve the public good. Some people think we just need more regulatory laws, but I think working in the Sierra Club and seeing how we have to just keep going back again and again and again to fight the corporations, and the agencies that have these regulations are not successful. So I don't think the regulatory system has worked very well, although at this time we still have it, and it's just about all we have to protect, you know, like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency protects air, land, and water, supposedly. But then if we look at the Gulf of Mexico right now, we have to wonder what happened here. Some people think we should hold a new constitutional convention and write a new constitution. Other people think that would be extremely dangerous because all the teabaggers might show up and write they would have so much of a voice. Sorry, apologies to any teabaggers in here. I shouldn't say that because we do have a lot in common with them. They are populists. Many of them are populists, which the Alliance for Democracy is a populist organization. Some people think we just need to pass stricter laws governing how our electeds are elected to limit campaign spending and so forth. And that's what Craig's going to talk about at the end of this presentation tonight. So I wanted to mention that I brought quite a few copies of our publication Justice Rising. And the new spring 2010 edition is called Courts and It's Justice Rising, Grassroots Solutions to Corporate Domination. That's always on our cover. And this issue is about courts and corporations versus our common good. And I brought plenty of copies for all of you. And if you know other people who would like a copy, you may take some extra copies. So let's see, there are also some other issues, previous issues that we had extra copies of about water. One of the things I work on is water for life, defending water for life. And if we have time later, I think my 15 minutes are up. If we have time later, I would like to tell you about a recent success in Snohomish County to defend our water. So if we have time, I'll tell you about that. It was very exciting, and it was a grassroots mobilization that worked. So,
Rebecca?
Yes?
Do you want to mention something about Ricky Ott's book?
Oh, thank you. This book is up here. Thank you. I think I'm a little nervous, but there are lots of copies of this $25 book that she gave to us to share. So help yourself. She gave me 800 copies. And so please take all the books tonight. They're heavy. Oh, I'm sorry. It's called Sound, Truth, and Corporate Myths, and it's about the pollution after the Exxon Valdez oil spill. I think the Gulf of Mexico should not be called a spill. It's an oil gusher. But this book is really timely and relevant right now. And this was her first book on the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and she's written a new one now, and which I can't remember the title of at the moment. But anyway, this is her first book, and it's kind of technical, but worth your time. So thank you. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Microphone. Just a minute. Get this.
And I'm here to turn your world upside down. So if you brought your tomatoes with you, hold on until the end of this presentation. Look, Citizens United is just the most recent stop in a long run of cases extending corporate civil rights. Perhaps the right to vote, the corporate right to bear arms, and corporate religion, as in Nikeism, Microsoftianity, and the Bank of America Church of the Mortgage Redeemer, are just over the constitutional horizon. But before we all work ourselves into a storm the Bastille lather, let us pause and look around and look at ourselves. Corporations are often as small and as local as they are large and multinational. They're like the zombie armies of the undead. They are here, they are everywhere, and they are sitting right next to you. Chances are very good that your neighborhood store is a corporation, as is your local restaurant, as is the local hardware store and the local auto repair shop down the street. Moreover, most large-scale projects in the United States occur in part because the entrepreneurs can undertake them as corporations. Now, without making a qualitative judgment whether some or any of the following are truly good things, consider that no shopping center, no high-rise office building or housing development, no communications network, no Hollywood movie, no computer manufacturer, no aircraft manufacturer, that means Boeing, no magazine, no gambling casino, no auto dealership, no gas station, no supermarket, no military weapons manufacturer, no offshore deep water drilling entity. None of them would come to be if they could not be undertaken in the form of a corporation. Consider furthermore how many of us have actually been co-opted into the corporate system through deliberate tax policy of forcing you and me and many to stash your so-called retirement accounts into Keogh 401k or IRA accounts. And how many middle-class homes go home every night, especially this night, religiously to check their portfolio on the New York or NASDAQ stock exchanges, concerned that if our corporate stock holdings fall in value, we may have to work until the day we die. Which begs the question whether you, as a shareholder of any corporation, really want to be personally liable for the misdeeds of the company whose stock you own in your own retirement accounts. It's a question of whether you really want your companies that you own to spend more on eleemosynary activities and less on pumping up the value of your retirement account. In short, the population in general in the United States has taken the bait, and they are now part of the profit-driven capitalist, political, economic system, and we are, as a nation, hooked on large corporations and Wild West capitalism, just as though we were an economic heroin junkie. Consider also, when we are talking about First Amendment rights, that a right in and of itself is just an empty state of mind, unless one has the means to enforce that right. Thus, if a mere pipsqueak person chooses to enforce his or her constitutional rights in a court of law, one first needs to have the proverbial good case, and then find a lawyer who will either take your case on a pro bono basis, which means at no charge, or you need to have sufficient money to hire counsel for the long and arduous and expensive journey that will take you through the court system. Big corporations, however, can always pay for counsel to address their civil rights, which is why large companies are not shy about suing municipal governments, counties, regulatory agencies, the federal government, and community groups when these entities or when these companies believe that the rights they hold dear, that is, their right to make money, is in jeopardy. Remember that the Citizens United group itself, and by the way, 2 members of the board of directors of Citizens United are actually from Washington State, and one of them, Kirby Wilbur, or Wilbur Kirby, is actually a former disc jockey for KJR Radio in this local area. That group, Citizens United, paid about $1.5 million in attorney's fees in order to get its case eventually heard by the United States Supreme Court. Therefore, when you consider the practicalities of actually enforcing your civil rights, money is the enforcer. Wherefore, some could argue large corporations actually have more rights than any of the rest of us. In earlier Supreme Court cases, the justices have held that money is the equivalent of free speech. And if money equals speech and the money put into corporate speech is uncontrollable, then money might as well equate to votes. When money talks, politicians listen. The problem is not so much freedom of speech as the freedom to be heard. If all you have is the right to speak, but no one can hear you, then your free speech is no better than a little schizophrenic voice whispering quietly in your own head to yourself. Now, we're not talking about the right to force people to hear what you want to say. We're talking about the realistic opportunity to be heard. The reality in our far-flung nation of 300 millions of people and our global empire of billions around the globe is that speech without the ability to be heard is meaningless. In our profit-driven, capital-intensive system, the only way you can be effectively heard is if you buy your access to the public ear. The bigger your mouth, the louder your speech. To have a big mouth these days means you have to have a lot of money to spend. Even if you can save all your pennies and mortgage your home, and you buy some TV airtime or an ad in the local struggling newspaper, or you're able to do some street theater, your speech will be blown away by the sheer media onslaught, the volume, the repetitiveness, the slickness, the skillfully manipulative speech of the deep corporate pockets. Nor is the internet enough, because there too the big pipes are owned by just a few monstrous telecommunications companies. And you should never assume.
Sorry, just need to break in for a second. Somebody is being blocked in the parking lot here from leaving. Does anybody here own a white van? Thank you.
Sure. You should never assume that the internet will always be free or accessible, unmonitored, or uncensored. Nor can you be sure that you will always be able to post content to YouTube or anywhere else, because the media giants and the RIAA, that's the Recording Industry Association of America, have served notice that they will sue the pants off anyone who infringes their seemingly interminable copyrights. Furthermore, you have no assurance that you will always have free access to the web, because the large media corporations seem intent on destroying the net neutrality of the web by giving preferential bandwidth and speed to the biggest and wealthiest users. Indeed, the internet was created by the government at public expense, and now the private for-profit sector acts like it owns it, which, thanks to the Telecommunications Act of 1996, maybe it does. Likewise, your speech on the web can be just as drowned out by the volume and intensity and coordination of the corporate message, and the dissenting voice, the alternative point of view, can be blown away just as easily in the ether as in the traditional state media. Yes, you can put in extraordinary time and effort. You can organize a few hundred of your friends to stage a demonstration for which you will be required to obtain a permit for some weekend afternoon where no one will see you and no media will give you more than 30 seconds coverage, and where, if you are lucky, you will not be enclosed in a razor wire free speech zone. Not all of us see the same problem. Our friends at the American Civil Liberties Union, and they are much of the time our friends, filed a friend of the court brief with the U.S. Supreme Court in Citizens United, supporting the free speech rights of corporations. From the perspective of the ACLU, limitations on free speech of any kind are a slippery slope for everyone. Therefore, the limitations on free speech inevitably leads to tyranny, and wherever there is more free speech, everyone wins. After all, the limitation on corporate political speech would also limit the speech of labor unions or of NGOs like the Sierra Club. From the perspective of the ACLU, if you would only join a large NGO like the ACLU, the NAACP, the Sierra Club, or the AFL-CIO, and give them your money and your energy, then you too will have the same speech rights that corporations have. The Citizens United decision is about 95 pages long, including all the headnotes and the dissents and everything else. But here's a quick and dirty distillation of the 5-judge majority opinion in the case. 1, political speech is good, therefore the more political speech, the better. 2, the government cannot restrict speech based on who is speaking, whether the speaker is a corporation, a union, an association, an NGO, or an individual. 3, the First Amendment right of political speech does not depend on your financial status or lack of status. That is, wealthy people have just as much a right of political free speech as do poor people, which means that you too can buy a multi-million-dollar TV network political advertising campaign just like Warren Buffett, if he were to do so. So everything's equal. Next, the high cost, this is in the opinion of the Supreme Court, the high cost of running for public office is irrelevant. I'll repeat that. The high cost of running for public office is irrelevant. Next, the government ought not to tell voters who has their interests in mind and who does not, or what is true and what is false. Rather, let everyone speak and entrust the people to decide for themselves. Bookmark that thought as we go through this discussion. Next, the appearance of corruption or money facilitating access to or influence over politics will not discourage people's belief in the political system. In other words, the amount of money coming in will not discourage you from participating in the political system. And ultimately, the fact that corporations are trying to influence the people's vote proves that in the final analysis, it is the people's vote that matters most, not the money spent to influence that vote. In sum, according to the Supreme Court, the people are still sovereign. And what that means by being sovereign is that the people are the boss. They're in control, because no matter how much money is spent by corporations to influence them, it is still the people's vote that makes them the boss and puts them in control. Now, in order to get inside the minds of the Citizens United majority opinion, I suggest people think in terms of what I call free market politics. Free market politics is like Milton Friedman's Chicago School of Free Market Capitalism. Free market politics, as the Supreme Court majority would consider it, essentially means that there is not just a free market of ideas, but a free market in the dissemination of those ideas. But like in the business world, the natural evolution of free market capital and the natural evolution of free market speech is the development of bigger and more monopolistic monoliths that dominate the arena. In the business world, it leads to the current situation on Wall Street with a shrinking number of bigger and bigger banks, the unregulated hyper-financial bubbles of the derivatives markets and hedge funds, a shrinking number of bigger and bigger media conglomerations, fewer and fewer automobile companies. There used to be 30, 40, 50 automobile manufacturers in the U.S. in the 1930s and 40s. Now there may be 2. It leads to the phenomenon of today's cable and satellite television, where you have thousands and thousands of channels with less and less substantive content. In short, free market politics, like free market economics, ineluctably leads to less variety and less substance in political speech, not more. The problem is that equating money with speech naturally leads to an arms race. If the only way one can be heard is to amalgamate with others in bigger and bigger groups so that you can raise more and more money for more and more expensive media campaigns, then eventually only the very biggest groups will ever be heard. Yes, the best funded, quote, liberal groups will be heard. The Sierra Club will be heard. The ACLU will be heard. MoveOn.org will be heard, as will the best funded conservative groups, such as the Chamber of Commerce, the Republican National Committee, and James Dobson's Focus on the Family. They will have no problems. The natural result of this arms race, however, is that individuals, remember the people that Rebecca was talking about, the people about whom the Bill of Rights is all about, individuals simply cannot compete with the big players. Worse, the process of getting bigger necessarily means a process of homogenization of ideas, because all big voluntary organizations necessarily have to develop the middling consensus in order to keep from being pulled apart. This inevitably leads to the self-censorship of the non-consensus points of view, and in addition, it also leads to a process where, unlike consensus, where you need to have consensus to get things done, in free speech, what you want to have is the ability to hear the minority point of view as well as the majority point of view. In short, the process of homogenizing speech by forcing people to only speak in large, well-funded groups is a surefire way to shrink the political dialogue to the point of antiseptic but politically irrelevant cocktail conversation. Let us consider a more fundamental point. The only speech worth defending is that of the minority, because the opinions and views of the majority do not need to be defended. The process of consensus building within any organization is necessarily the process of constructing a majority opinion. And in the process of building consensus, the individual point of view always gets discarded. The Supreme Court is in essence encouraging us to ally in groups to practice groupthink and group speech. For the consensus of the group is always less dangerous than that of the free-thinking and free-speaking individual. And I'd like to return to the central thread of the majority opinion in Citizens United. The U.S. Supreme Court, in a sense, is tweaking our noses with our own platitudes and notions of democracy. You say the people are sovereign. You say we're the boss. You say we live in a democracy where the people rule. You say that people are smart enough to govern themselves. You say that we are all created equal. You say that you want power to the people. You say that might doesn't make right, that the pen is mightier than the sword, and that money can't buy you love. All right, says the majority of the Supreme Court, if you are that smart, that equal, that clever, and that powerful, then you can figure it out for yourselves. What is true and false, good and bad, naughty and nice, and you do not need a meddlesome, paternalistic government to protect you from big, bad corporations. And that, in essence, is what the Supreme Court is saying. Caveat emptor, or caveat votor, says the majority of the Supreme Court, as it piles on the bromides of free market democracy. Let the voter beware. On the face of it, this is a noble thought. But the reality is that some referee has to be able to blow the whistle when a foul has been committed, or the game will be nothing more than like TV wrestling, with the strong beating up on the weak. Essentially, the Supreme Court is dissing the Ralph Nader philosophy that it is wrong for corporations to suborn the public interest by ubiquitous advertising, sexy product packaging, and slick marketing campaigns. The majority of the Supreme Court is saying, in a manner of speaking, that when it comes to political speech, it is not the government's business to prevent GM from selling a Corvair that flips over at 35 miles an hour, or to tell Toyota not to sell a car that accelerates to highway speeds on its own. And it is especially not the government's business to protect you from the excesses of corporate political propaganda. The Supreme Court majority holds that the very fact corporations spend so much money trying to influence the people's vote proves that our vote is what really matters. But viewed through the other end of the telescope, corporations spend so much money trying to influence your vote precisely because they know that it works. You have only to look at what happened during the recent debacle about health care reform to understand how effective is the power of money applied to political processes and the manipulation of public opinion. To understand how well they understand how to manipulate us, you have only to look at how easily Madison Avenue has persuaded us to buy what we don't want, what we don't need, and what we cannot afford. The institutions of many states, Inquisition Spain, Stalin's USSR, Hitler's Third Reich, the military-industrial institutions of our own Bush-Obama continuum, how easily they have been able to break strong men's and women's wills, twist their minds, persuade them to confess the most improbable crimes, persuade people that less is more, war is peace, that freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, because we have all been caused to seek succor and comfort from fear and the smothering embrace of the security state. The real issue posed by the Supreme Court's somewhat ironic commentary is, what does it mean to be sovereign? What does it mean to be the boss? Are the people sovereign? Are you? Am I? To be sovereign means to be independent and unlimited by any other authority. Do the majority of people even want to be sovereign? In light of what you believe about the majority of Americans, do you want the people to be sovereign? What does this say about democracy? What does it say about majority rule? During the American War of Independence, and I call it the War of Independence because it was not a revolution, not even a majority of the colonials at that time favored independence. The majority were either apolitical, apathetic, or they were Tories who favored remaining loyal British colonies. In short, they were like a majority of our own society today. Socially conservative, interested in preserving their own material best interests, and wary of change. Human nature favors the conservation of energy, which translated into the political sphere means that people would rather conserve energy by sitting on a couch, watching television, chugging beer, than put the energy into such esoteric things as we're talking about today. And who am I, who are you, to tell them to do otherwise? Consider your own genetic progeny. It makes for a more evolutionary, sensible strategy to keep your head low in your foxhole than to demand liberty or death, for history proves that you are far more likely to achieve the latter than the former. So long as people have their jobs, meaningless though they might be, their job-related health care benefits, their mortgage-encumbered homesteads, their barbecues, their video games, their drugs of choice, their big screen TVs, their 401ks, the possibility that their children might have a chance to go to college and advance themselves a little up the social ladder, then the bulk of the people, if not necessarily content, will not rebel. It won't be like Greece. Then why should they care whether they are or are not sovereign? Why should they care whether some multinational corporations or gangs of corporations runs their lives? People should care, because large corporations will now use their unlimited moneyed speech to elect politicians who will further offshore their jobs, foreclose more of their homes, liquidate more of their 401ks to pay the investment bank executives, and put the price of a college education beyond the reach of their children. And when you fall ill, without any coherent single-payer universal health care system, we will still be bankrupted by the medical system. Indeed, with only limited moneyed speech, they've already done most of these things. Prior to Citizens United, with the fig leaves still in place in our mythical free speech Garden of Eden, people could claim they did not know how disadvantaged they were. But the Supreme Court has now ripped off the fig leaves. And can the people still deny that they are completely naked? This was the deal made with the American people after the United States emerged as the sole victor at the end of the Second World War. The people would stay out of the governance business, and business would take care of the people. It is Fordism, a form of corporate benevolence granted in exchange for ceding sovereignty to big business. Fordham is a kind of benevolent dependency. It is a parent-child relationship where the corporation is your wise daddy Warbucks, and we, the citizens, are the dependents, the immature children who have to be led, who have to be told what is in our best interests, and a democracy that has to be managed for its own good. And so it has been in the U.S. since about 1945. Being sovereign, that is, being the boss, being in control, is the antithesis of being dependent. A sovereign people that can govern itself does not depend on corporations, or for that matter on the government, for their jobs. A sovereign does not accept benefits granted by others. A sovereign does not plead, does not beg, does not petition, does not complain about what is fair or unfair. A sovereign does, takes, demands, mandates, and acts. So are the people really sovereign or not? The problem has been addressed in different ways by different peoples. The Bolsheviks created a dictatorship of the proletariat to guide and govern the people until they could learn how to govern themselves, right? But the people did not learn, and the Stalinist dictators became the new governing elites. The French Revolution became a bourgeois revolution, and then it became an empire. Sacre bleu. The Chinese Revolution threw out the capitalist regime, and now 50 years later, China is more capitalist than America. And who are we who refused to pay obeisance to a British aristocracy back in 1776, and who now bow down to a new aristocracy that inherits wealth and power and lords it over us as so many ennobled corporations? If the people object to the premise of Citizens United, that the things are the way they are, then are the people really ready, willing, and able to assume their own sovereignty? Assuming the people are not sovereign, then the real issue is, how do the people become sovereign? How do you become in charge? It is not just a matter of changing the law, for the Supreme Court has decreed that the issue is constitutional in nature, and the mere laws of Congress yield to the Constitution as the Supreme Court interprets it. You can amend the Constitution to strip personhood from corporations, or even mandate 10-year terms for Supreme Court justices, but that would require a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress and confirmation by 3/4 of the state legislatures, or a constitutional convention called by 2/3 of the states and approved by 3/4 of the state legislatures. And I don't quite see the groundswell of support for this among either the Democratic or Republican Party leadership. You can employ the impeachment procedure to remove members of the Supreme Court. But impeachment is apparently a constitutional process as quaint and outdated as the Geneva Convention, so according to Alberto Gonzalez, and perhaps as outdated as that exclusive constitutional power of Congress to declare war. Remember, that's in the Constitution as well. Rarely used, if ever, anymore. You can even daydream about packing the Supreme Court, as Franklin Roosevelt sought to do in 1937 by adding up to 6 new justices. But that's just daydreaming. The bottom line is that there is no political power or free speech without political sovereignty. The ravenous lions will not lie down with the lambs except to eat them. And if the meek inherit the earth, it will be an earth covered in BP's oil. It is not about exercising political power or about persuading anyone to do anything. It is a matter of maturing into power. One earns sovereign status, or you assume it, or you create it for yourself. It cannot be given to you.
How many of you are on our mailing list for Wash Clean or Washington Public Campaigns? Okay, about half. Washington Public Campaigns? Yeah. All right. Well, I hope you will be by the time I'm done or the evening's over, okay? How many of you have ever been part of a delegation to an elected official to do some citizen lobbying? Citizen lobbying. Okay. How many of you were disappointed that we didn't get a public option or single payer?
They're very different.
I'm trying to,
Single payer first.
I know, I did that on purpose, Catherine, okay. Listen, I'm gonna be a lot briefer and just, some scattered comments, I think, but I did want to provide some information, and then I think, before we're done, we'll certainly open it up for some comments. Clearly, the issue is governance by the people or by the money. And I think nowhere, all of us know this, nowhere was that more clear than last year in the whole debate over healthcare reform and what we got or what we didn't get. That's partly why I wanted to get a sense of how many of you were plugged in on that. So since a lot of you were, I'm not going to recite some of the usual facts and figures. The fact that roughly $500 million was spent by the insurance industry and the pharmaceutical industry influencing the Congress, that another $150 million was spent in direct campaign contributions, because you probably know that. I guess I did just mention it, didn't I? How many of you ever saw the movie It's a Wonderful Life? Jimmy Stewart, right? I think that we should get a clip from that movie where he's talking about the purpose of banking. Remember? Okay. The purpose of banking is to grease the economy, not to make money on money. So clearly, we've got a problem. As Bill Moyers likes to point out, money and wealth is so dominating our democracy today, our lawmaking at every level, that it's really hard to say, as he points out, that America is working for Americans anymore. And we've got to change it. I think that there's probably a fair amount of agreement on what needs to be done. The question may have more to do with how are we going to do it. And I think we have to remind ourselves, this is part of the glass is half full speech, okay? At the end of the day, there's more of us than them. Okay? So if ever we've raised a barn or pulled a big stump out of the ground or done anything where that's really the answer to politics. I think that one of the big challenges we face is not so much the folks who are in the room tonight, but a lot of our neighbors and friends out there who may be part of our book clubs or our faith groups or churches or our unions or whatever, so that we move people from awareness of how they are impacted or injured by the current system to knowing that there are some solutions that we can engage in, to knowing enough about those solutions that they become advocates, to becoming organizers, so that then we are pulling together. That, I want to talk to this group, just briefly about political action, because I think you're there. The question is, how do we mobilize ourselves into political action to make change? Let me back up just a little bit and say a couple of things, though. I think how many of you are aware of public financing of campaigns, also known as clean elections, voter-owned elections, the Fair Elections Now Act, somewhat, mostly? I may say just a couple of words about it. If you want to know more, talk to me afterwards. Go to our website. There's a sheet. There's a lot of this literature in the back on the table there, right to the left. This is a pretty good summary of how fair elections work. And there's some other literature that I'm going to refer to a little bit. But in a nutshell, you guys, here's what I think. And I've been at the public financing advocacy stuff for about 4 years now. I didn't used to know about it. I want to tell you that. I moved to this, as Lou knows, because I was really active on single-payer health care. And then after a lot of us were scratching our heads saying, why aren't we making progress on that? It became very, very obvious that until we break the link of big money controlling lawmaking in Congress, and even down in Olympia, and to some extent in our local city councils, we are not really going to see progress on just about every issue that we care about. Scratch any issue. Energy policy, financial policy, healthcare, worker safety on the job, environmental protection. I mean, we could go on and on. Scratch any issue and we find big money calling the shots. We have to change how campaigns are financed so that we can get to some of the other things that we want to get to. I don't think public financing is a silver bullet. There's a lot of things wrong with it, but unless we change how campaigns are financed, we won't get to some of the other things, such as control of the airwaves for the people versus the corporations, such as whether or not regulations in regulatory agencies are simply a revolving door where basically the regulatory agency gets captured by the corporate interest. We won't get to that stuff. So in case you think, I'm just trying to sell snakehold here, I want to tell you, remember Governor Rod Blagojevich, in Illinois? If that state had had public financing for campaigns, he could have run on public money, got elected, and then just as dirty as he is or was. So it's not a silver bullet. But here's what goes on. It's not that the people we elect, that their votes are for sale. It's that they swim in a system where the whole system is for sale. That's what goes on. You all know that. And I'm trying to make some of these points not because I think you don't know. I think this is how we have to talk about it to our friends and neighbors. When politicians can run on public money, here's the difference it makes. Maine, state of Maine, passed clean elections about 12 years ago. They've now had 5 or 6 election cycles where their legislature can run on public financing. If Rebecca wanted to run, she would have to gather 200 signatures to qualify from people in her district in Maine, backed by $5 from each one of those donors. That would have to get turned into a commission to validate the signatures, and then she would get given a check to run her campaign. Not just the $5, but enough money to run a competitive campaign. In Maine today, think about this, 84% of their legislature, over 4 out of 5, is elected on public financing. We got to tell our neighbors. What difference does it make? They stare down big tobacco. They passed the toughest laws in the nation on teenage smoking because they could. They don't need that tobacco money to get reelected, right? They stare down the insurance industry and the pharmaceutical industry. Maine was the first state in the nation to bring down the price of prescription drugs because they could. They closed tax loopholes because they could. Folks, we got to do this. This is pushing a very big rock up a very steep hill. I mean, I don't want to minimize, the task before us, but we can do it. There are now 7 states that have public financing of campaigns of one set or another. In North Dakota, public financing for their Supreme Court races. In New Mexico, public financing for people who are elected to their Utilities Commission. It's called the Corporations Commission. That's the commission that regulates utility rates in big corporations. So glass is half full. We can do this if we're organized. And I can tell you, a little more about how it works. I want to make sure that you all pick up a copy of these flyers about the Fair Elections Now Act in the United States Congress. There's also a bigger sheet. It's all back on the table. You'll see it, okay? here's what the Fair Elections Now Act in the United States Congress would do. It's a bill that is in the U.S. Senate and in the U.S. House. As recently as 4 or 5 months ago, there were very few co-sponsors. But now, as a result of Citizens United, the Supreme Court actually did us a favor, okay? They put wind in the sails of our movement because so many Americans are outraged at that decision that we're suddenly getting a whole lot of people on the side of public financing of campaigns, one of the few solutions we've really got. The way it would work, the Fair Elections Now Act, if that were law and Patty Murray were running today, she needs to raise about $12 million in order to, for a winning campaign for the United States Senate. And by the way, that is the average cost of a winning Senate seat. In California, big state, $35 million, okay? You might ask your neighbors, who has that kind of money? Well, the insurance industry, Wall Street, okay? If the Fair Elections Now Act were law, she would only, Patty Murray or a challenger, anybody, would only have to raise slightly less than $2 million in order to qualify for $13 million in public financing. Big difference, okay? Because what really goes on, and those of us that have done more and more lobbying, have learned this more closely, it's not that their vote is bought. It's that the really big money threatens to take out a lawmaker, if you know what I mean, who doesn't vote their way. Blanche Lincoln, Arkansas, she's in a swing state. By the way, I don't know the woman, okay? But we all know that she was a swing vote against what we really wanted to see happen in healthcare reform, right? And she took a lot of Wall Street money. She needs a lot of money because she's in a swing state. If she wants to get reelected, she's got to have a lot of money. And where does she get it? The people who are glad to give it to her. And there's kind of a quid pro quo. So then what happens is, it's the threat that they're going to run somebody against her from, the right or just from some other place that keeps her in line. That is how our Congress is for sale. We need to understand that if we're going to fix it. Here's how else it's for sale. Tons of money, way more money than was ever spent on Blanche Lincoln's campaign, gets spent in propaganda in the airways to convince the voters. Okay? These are the same voters that are busy taking the kids to soccer, trying to take a class at night at school, mow the lawn, buy groceries. We're busy. Why is it that we are so susceptible to the propaganda from the airways? It's because how many of us have time to just study every issue? So money that buys propaganda, through Comcast and all that, absolutely can make the difference. It's not just the campaign cash, it is this whole flood of money that comes piling in. And again, we just have to understand that. We can change this. I'm not a pessimist on this, but we've got to understand what's going on. So, trying to wrap up here a little bit. A couple of things that we're doing. Washington Public Campaigns has launched a thing called, this summer, here's what we're doing. It's on the back side of this sheet, the Election Season Advocacy Project. We're trying to be organized. We sent out last week over 300 pieces of mail to everybody who's running for office in Washington State this year. Everybody who's running for a federal office, everybody who's running for the legislature and the Supreme Court races. And what we said to them is, do you or don't you know about public financing of campaigns? Here's some literature about it. By the way, we hope that voters in your district will talk to you about this and so forth. What we're trying to do is get them on board to understand, so that we can begin to create some lawmakers who will enact public financing in this state. We hope that this coming January, for the first time, we can finally get a judicial bill through. This would be public financing of our state Supreme Court. We want to just break that glass ceiling, as it were, where we just get some statewide office publicly financed. Once we've done that, we can begin to expand that to the whole legislature and to all the statewide races. So I hope all of you will get on board with us on that. You know, come next January, we need to be saying this to our legislators. In Washington State, our courts are not for sale. We want public financing if people want to run for the state Supreme Court, so that they are not for sale and they are not beholden to the building industry or to any other special interest. We can do this. We almost got the bill through this last session. It actually went as far as the floor of the Senate. We almost got it through. One more shot, I'm pretty sure we can get it. Here's what we're doing federally. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock, there's going to be a delegation meeting going to see Patty Murray, her staff person, Sheila Babb. This is about the 9th meeting in the last 6 weeks that Sheila Babb of her staff has had all around the state. The coffee party has been to see her. MoveOn.org has been to see her. That's actually what's happening tomorrow afternoon. In order to soften her up, I hate this analogy, but I'm going to use it anyway, okay? I wasn't in the service, Lou, but I hear what you're supposed to do is bombard the beaches, you know, before you land, right? Okay, apply that to politics. MoveOn.org in Seattle, which has 53,000 people on the mailing list, has had 4 calling parties, Sunday night, Monday night, last night, and as we speak. And they are calling members of MoveOn to in turn call Patty Murray, are you with me on this? Saying, please co-sponsor the Fair Elections Now Act. By the time we go to see her tomorrow, she's going to have received probably 2,000 or 3,000 emails and phone calls. Folks, this is how we make change. If we can get Patty Murray to sign on to the Fair Elections Now Act, she will be the 18th U.S. Senator that's on that bill. Let me tell you what's going on in the House. 2 months ago, there were about 20 people co-sponsoring the bill in the House. You know what it is today? It's up to 149. 149 members of Congress have signed on to it. Partly because of the wind in the sails from the Citizens United ruling, partly because people are just plain mad and saying, you know, we're tired of Wall Street running our democracy. So that's essentially the message that I wanted to convey. Let me make a couple of other quick points. This was something that I learned from a workshop that was held back in Spokane recently. Boy, I just thought it was excellent, I got to tell you. The woman who ran the workshop was a rural organizer in Washington. Marcy Westerling is her name. And she ran a workshop pointing out the difference between advocates and organizers. Very interesting. She first said to people, do you see yourself as an advocate or as an organizer? Everybody said, what's the difference? Here's the difference. An advocate who is for single payer blares single payer out at everybody that we talk to. I used to do this, okay? An organizer, which is what we need to become, learns how to listen and ask a question. How's your health care working? Are you happy with it? Okay, have you ever thought of these alternatives? If we're going to make change, like bringing about public financing and eventually, you know, the other kind of change we need, I think that every single one of us has got to turn into an organizer if we're not there already. Folks, we've got to do it. We've just got to move people. Keep in mind, there's more of us than there are corporations on Wall Street. So if we organize, we can make this change. The only reason that we've been losing so far is because we haven't been organized. It's not enough. And I guess the last thing I wanted to make a plug for is how many of us think that economic, political, social change has ever been brought about in this country without an organization that's making it happen. So it's not only that we've got to become organized, it's that we have to support the organizations that are bringing about the change that we want to see. If it's the Coffee Party, if it's Move On, if it's the progressive wing of the Democrats, if it's Wash Clean, ACLU, Friends of the Earth, you know, pick an organization. Justice Rising, okay? Alliance for Democracy. You know, that's where our resources have got to go. Because I'm going to tell you, you know, it does take some cash and some resources and volunteer time to make this change, you know, happen. I'm really preaching to the choir here, you know, so I know that. That is pretty much what I wanted to say. We are trying to do one other thing, which is this. We're trying to connect the dots. Campaign finance reform is not on the tip of most people's tongue. What is on the tip of their tongue is healthcare reform, oil gushers, you know, Wall Street banking and that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I think as organizers, we have to show people that if you really want to make progress on some of these different issues, you have to care about campaign finance reform. It is absolutely related. That's what we've got to do. So thank you. I'll sit down and take some questions.
Claudia, I actually see two separate questions in what you're talking about, and they're actually rather profound if you boil them down to the bottom line. There is a huge body of corporate law in the U.S., and it expands by leaps and bounds on a daily basis. Ultraviars actually still exists. It is a legal concept. It's still there. I think when you're talking about the difference between large and small corporations, yes, the social democracies, particularly in Northern Europe, I'm thinking of the Scandinavian countries, do just that. Smaller companies, which are mom and pop type operations, are essentially privately owned, and the larger entities, which are considered to be of national significance, are owned by the state. They're publicly owned. It's a form of commons. And by the way, I think you all ought to be thinking about commons when you're discussing this kind of issue. A lot of places do that. So when it comes to things like petroleum reserves, railroads, post offices, why the U.S. is going towards privatization of all these entities which should be subsidized and publicly owned is beyond, it's not beyond me. I understand exactly why it's happening. Your other question had to do with legislating morality, and I don't think that's ever going to happen, nor do I think it's a good thing to do, because there are states that legislate morality. They're generally theocratic states, and we need to be very careful about wishing that. Watch out what you wish for, you might get it. But the morality you wish for may not be the morality we all want.
Just a quick comment as well, that the same political muscle that it would take to make some of these changes. I mean, corporations get chartered. They get chartered by states. So partly the question is, what kind of political muscle would it take to change the law governing charters? And so then, you know, if we can achieve that level of community organizing, to have that level of political muscle, to me then the practical question becomes, where should we best direct it so that we achieve the result that we want, if that makes any sense. I mean,
Can I make just one more comment in response to Claudia's? People are aware that Great Britain just had an election. Very interesting. It lasted 30 days. That was the campaign. 30 days. That's done by law. Second thing is, they have a parliamentary form of government. And by the way, I think if you were to go back and check, some folks like Jefferson were not even enamored with the idea that the Constitution would become something like Mosaic law brought down from Mount Sinai. That was not the intention. The intention was that every few generations people would remake the form of government that was appropriate for their times. You know, there are some stirring aspects of U.S. holy papers, if you will. One is the Declaration of Independence. 2/3 of it is very, very, very revolutionary. 2/3 of it. The Bill of Rights was an afterthought It was forced onto people. It was enacted, I think, 6 years after the Constitution was finally put in, and it was a deal made with horse trading in return for slavery remaining and other things and so forth. And it was a close call. There almost was no Constitution. It was a very close call. The Constitution itself has got some strange things in it, even to this day. It is not a holy document, okay? One of the problems that you have is you can't have a solution in the U.S. like they just had in Britain, where they now have a coalition government for the first time in many years, because you don't have a parliamentary system. You don't have it in the U.S. We have a winner-take-all system. That's what the presidential system is. Plus, you cannot bring down the government in the U.S. You have to wait for the election cycle. In parliamentary systems, if there is a loss of confidence in the state, you can have snap elections. Things can change when people become unhappy. So when you're talking about political processes, bear in mind that there are many kinds of political processes out there. We get very chauvinistic when we think ours is the only way, because ours is the only one we're used to, because we're really kind of isolated over here in the northern part of the Americas, where there are lots of American citizens, remember, but some of them live over here in the part that's called the U.S.
Yesterday, yesterday I received an email from a candidate who's running for state senate in this state, and he was boasting about the fact that he had already collected, I think it was $120,000. This is Snohomish County, one legislative district. And he was boasting about the fact that he had collected, collected, I guess, more than all three of his opponents combined. So I wrote to him right away, and I said, do you favor campaign finance reform, publicly funded campaigns, so that all people who are worthy candidates would have an equal opportunity to run for office? And this morning I had a phone call back, but I didn't take time to call him back. It was on my message machine because I really want to talk to him, because he's in the Senate now. He's running. He's an incumbent, and there is such power in incumbency, right? Yeah, Steve Hobbs, yeah. And he has three opponents, but he's really boasting about that. But I want to piggyback on something that Craig talked about I want to stand up to tell you this little story. I told you I would if I could. Recently, somebody sent me, I'm conservation chair of the Sierra Club, Snohomish County. Somebody sent me a copy of the Everett Herald article that said there is a private corporation called Tethys, T-E-T-H-Y-S, which is the name for the goddess of fresh water. And they want to build a 1 million square foot bottling plant alongside the Snohomish River for intensive water uses. The contract was, I got a copy of the contract and read it. And so the people who contacted me were very concerned. And of course I was concerned because I'm working for Defending Water for Life. So I got in touch with everybody I knew in the Audubon group, Sierra Club, there was Everett Shorelines Coalition, and then we went around to the neighborhood associations and just talked about bottled water and all the environmental downsides of bottled water. And then Mr. Winter, the CEO, started coming to our meetings and saying, oh, we might not even bottle water. We might do teas, or we might do flavored drinks, or we might do something completely different. And he had promised 1,000 new jobs to the county, which was the big bait. But he had nothing in the contract to assure any jobs, and he didn't even say exactly what he was going to do in this 1 million square. So anyway, we started writing letters and going to city council meetings and just saying we want our water protected. With global warming and increasing population in Snohomish County, we do not want this. 5 million gallons a day for 30 years is what they wanted. 5 million gallons a day for 30 years locked up. And guess what? The 4 votes out of 7 who were going to vote for the contract, they got reversed. The mayor said no deal. So the power of the people, I mean, it is real. We can do this, and we were more than 7 city council members. So that kind of thing does happen.
There's quite a few of us in this room that have been to jail more than once for justice, okay? So I think the challenge from political period to political period is to spot where, if there's a whole river of politics, where are the currents moving the fastest that are moving in a progressive fashion? I happen to think that last year one of the strongest movements was the movement for health care reform, and it's still there because every kitchen table is dealing with health care reform in some fashion right now. It is an issue that hits everybody. And the real solution to healthcare, affordable health care in America, is essentially a socialist solution. Now, we're not seeing the same kind of radicalism going on in America today that was going on when I was growing up, through high school and college because of the Vietnam War going on, okay? But I think as organizers, we have to get good at, and I'm trying to answer Fred's question, where is the movement? In case you didn't hear me before, I don't see public financing of campaigns as a whole revolutionary solution. But I see it as doable. And more to the point, I think that the forces in our society that we are going to be able to rope into a movement to change that are potentially significant political forces. I'm trying to not use the word revolutionary. Folks, we've got to get good at spotting game-changing reforms from just Band-Aid reforms. Changing how our elections work. I mean, I'd love it if we could go to 30 days election. That's not going to happen soon. I'd love it if we had a parliamentary system. Here's what's closest to parliamentary system is ranked choice voting, right? How are we doing? So as organizers, if you consider yourself an organizer, I think many of us do, we've got to get to the point, my opinion, where we spot those kinds of reforms that are game-changing reforms, and then we figure out who in our neighborhoods is the constituency that most would benefit from it. Here's just one example. It's all I wanted to say. Payday loans stinks. You know what I'm talking about? Okay. There are constituencies that are really being abused by payday loans. I think that we should be splitting off the credit union movement from the banking movement and say to credit unions, let's move into that market and offer the payday loan service at a reasonable amount. Let's turn that into a movement that establishes a state bank of Washington like they have in North Carolina, all right? North Dakota, so that we are calculatingly looking at issues where there is somebody in our neighborhoods that's in motion, if you know what I mean by that, and we're figuring out how to capture that and use it to make a reform happen. Last year, you all know, we were circulating flyers that said, if you care about real health care reform, you have to care about public financing. The result of that is we now have a tight coalition with the health care reform groups backing the FINA bill in Congress. I see that as revolutionary. I'd love it if we could just get rid of Wall Street. Listen, David Corton, have you read his books? Okay. But we've got to be calculating about what kind of change we can make, I think, week to week. And so, Fred, that's my brief response. Yeah.
In environmental work, a lot of us really believe that what we need are rights for nature because nature cannot speak for itself. And if we could just somehow do what Ecuador and Bolivia have done and get that into our constitution or even our state constitutions, it would just be a huge help. So I know it's not revolutionary. I know David Cobb talks in the Move to Amend movement. He is talking a lot about anarchy. I'm not a proponent of anarchy. I don't think we have grassroots movements, we have populist movements, but anarchy I don't think is a really good idea.
From the beginning of this country, property rights have been on top. By the way, the group that I belong to and the organization I locally chair, the National Lawyers Guild, states in its preamble that we stand for the proposition that human rights are superior to property rights. But as far as the U.S. government is concerned, it has not adopted the international issue on human rights that you're talking about, and it's not likely that it will in the foreseeable future. The Constitution, if you look at it, has to do with issues of protocol, procedure, and the enforcement of and maintenance of property rights. And in fact, that's what the court system is primarily about. I didn't have time today to go into the longer version of this discussion, which is really what is the court system and where did it come from? And you'll find that, in fact, when you get to the question of governance, most governments are instituted for the protection of property. And property rights, human rights, is a relatively novel concept, except when you are dealing with things that date back to Magna Carta and other types of issues which have been incorporated into our legal jurisprudence and stuff like that. So it's an excellent question, much deeper than we can possibly go into today.
Well, let's thank our